What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
You know that feeling when life hands you a golden ticket, but instead of shouting it from the rooftops like some fairy tale character, you clamp your mouth shut and decide to play detective with your own family's loyalty. All because years of being the dependable one have left you wondering if anyone would show up for you without an ulterior motive driving them forward? Well, that's exactly where I found myself on that drizzly Tuesday evening in my modest two-bedroom apartment in suburban Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place where the walls are thin enough to hear your neighbors arguing over utility bills, and the fridge hums like an old friend who's seen better days. As I sat glued to the edge of my worn-out couch watching the National Lottery drawing unfold on the flickering screen of my 20-year-old television set, my heart pounding in a rhythm that matched the announcer's excited voice rattling off the winning numbers that impossibly aligned with the crumpled ticket I'd purchased. On impulse after a particularly grueling shift at the accounting firm where I spent my days reconciling ledgers for clients who treated me like an afterthought. $15 million, a sum so staggering it could erase every financial worry I'd carried since my divorce a decade earlier when my ex-husband, that self-absorbed salesman with a penchant for bad decisions, walked out with half our savings and left me to raise our son Jake on a single income that barely covered the mortgage and the endless stream of school fees. But in that moment of stunned silence, as the confetti exploded virtually across the screen, I didn't feel the rush of euphoria everyone imagines. Instead, a cold calculation settled over me like the autumn chill seeping through the cracked windowpane, prompting me to stash the ticket in a lockbox under my bed and vow to keep the entire windfall a secret from the world, especially from my scattered family, who had a history of showing up only when it suited their own needs. I'd always been the rock for them, the sister who wired money to my older sibling Linda during her string of failed business ventures in the 90s when she was chasing that American dream of flipping houses before it became a buzzword. The aunt who covered holiday gifts for her kids when her commissions dried up, and the mother who juggled two jobs so Jake could pursue his passion for music without the immediate pressure of student loans crushing his spirit. Yet in return, their support had been as reliable as a summer storm in Ohio, fierce when it hit, but gone before you could catch your breath, leaving you soaked and questioning if the effort was worth the fleeting warmth. As the weeks slipped by in a blur of cautious planning, I navigated the logistics of claiming the prize through a discreet lawyer I'd researched late into the night on my laptop. The one who assured me that anonymity was possible in a state like Ohio, where privacy laws shielded winners from the vultures circling every big jackpot story you read about in the papers. And I funneled the bulk of the funds into conservative investments that promised steady growth without the flashy risks that had sunk so many lottery tales into bankruptcy court headlines, all while maintaining my routine of clocking in at the office, brewing coffee in the break room with colleagues who complained about gas prices and rising grocery costs in ways that mirrored my own pre-win existence, and pretending to fret over my checking account balance that now hit a fortune capable of buying a quiet farm upstate or funding Jake's wildest band aspirations without a second thought. But the real test, the one that kept me up at night staring at the ceiling fan's lazy spin as shadows danced across the popcorn texture above, was how to gauge the people closest to me without tipping my hand. So I crafted a scenario straight out of those cautionary tales you hear at family reunions about testing loyalties before committing to vulnerability, deciding to fabricate a personal financial crisis that would force them to reveal their true colors under the guise of everyday hardship, a move that felt both ingenious and a tad manipulative in the quiet hours when doubt crept in like fog off the Scioto River, making me wonder if I was setting myself up for more isolation rather than the clarity I craved after years of one-sided generosity. I started small, dialing Linda first during what I hoped would pass as a casual lunch at her sprawling McMansion on the outskirts of town, the one she'd acquired through a series of real estate deals that always seemed to involve just enough shortcuts to raise an eyebrow but never enough to get her in real trouble. And as we sat at her granite kitchen island sipping lukewarm coffee from mugs she'd probably bought at a discount warehouse sale, I wove in the details of my invented woes with a voice laced just enough weariness to sound authentic without overplaying the drama. Linda, Work's been a nightmare lately with all the talk of downsizing and my old car's throwing more tantrums than a toddler on a road trip. Any chance you could loan me a couple thousand for repairs until I get back on my feet? Maybe pay you back next month when things stabilize? I asked, watching her perfectly highlighted hair catch the sunlight streaming through the bay window as she paused mid-sip. Her manicured fingers drumming a subtle rhythm on the countertop that betrayed the calculations running through her mind before she launched into a well-rehearsed monologue about personal finance apps and the importance of building an emergency fund, ultimately promising to look into it while deftly steering the conversation toward her latest vacation snapshots from a cruise down the Gulf Coast, complete with selfies that screamed more extravagance than the modest life she claimed to lead, leaving me with nothing but a hollow pat on the back and a link to some online budgeting seminar texted to my phone as she walked me to the door with that signature smile that always managed to mix sympathy with superiority. Emboldened by her evasion yet stung by the familiarity of it all, I moved on to Jake later that evening through a series of texts since his phone calls were as sporadic as his gig bookings, crafting a message that pulled at the maternal strings without begging outright, explaining how bills were stacking up like cordwood and I might need a hand with a few hundred to keep the lights on, only to receive a delayed response that consisted of little more than an empathetic emoji followed by a vague assurance that he was in the same boat with his music career hitting a dry spell. No offer forthcoming even as I pictured him strumming his guitar in some dimly lit practice space funded by odd jobs that never seemed to stick. It was Mark's turn next, my younger brother whose life had taken a quieter path as a mechanic in a small garage on the east side of the city. The one he'd inherited from Dad after that heart attack back in the early 2000s left our family splintered and scrambling. And when I called him during his lunch break with the same story of mounting pressures and a vehicle on the brink, his gravelly voice cut through the line without hesitation, immediately offering to cover $1,000 by the end of the week from his overtime earnings, no probing questions or conditions attached. Just the straightforward reliability I'd remembered from our childhood days when he'd tag along to my softball games and share his peanut butter sandwiches without a second thought. Yet as I ended the call and settled back into the solitude of my living room with its faded family photos lining the mantel, snapshots of holidays long past where smiles hid the undercurrents of resentment, I couldn't shake the gnawing uncertainty that this experiment might unearth more pain than answers, especially when Linda's follow-up text arrived like clockwork, forwarding that seminar invite with a note dripping condescension about how it had saved her bacon once, a reminder of the times I'd quietly covered her shortfalls without fanfare, fueling a spark of petty retribution in my chest as I began toying with the idea of an anonymous nudge to her professional circle about one of those less-than-ethical property deals she'd bragged about over Thanksgiving turkey last year. But just as I was mapping out the details in my mind, my phone lit up with an unexpected call from Jake, his tone sharper than usual as he demanded specifics on my situation, insisting on proof like bank statements or layoff notices to understand better, a probe that sent a chill down my spine and made me realize this web of deception was tightening around me faster than I'd anticipated, pulling me toward confrontations I hadn't fully prepared for and leaving the question hanging in the air. Like the last note of a suspenseful song, how much deeper would I have to dive before the truth started bubbling up to the surface? That envelope from Mark arrived right on schedule the following Friday morning, slipped under my apartment door with his familiar scrawl on the front reading, "For whatever you need, M, take care." And as I tore it open in the quiet of my kitchen where the morning light filtered through the blinds casting long shadows across the linoleum floor that I'd scrubbed 100 times after long shifts, I felt a complicated swirl of gratitude mixed with suspicion because his willingness to part with $1,000 from what I knew was a paycheck-to-paycheck existence as a mechanic in that underfunded garage on the east side of Columbus seemed almost too genuine in a family where favors usually came wrapped in expectations or outright demands, prompting me to pocket the cash while pondering the irony of testing loyalties only to uncover a depth of kindness that made my fabricated crisis feel like a cruel joke on the one person who didn't deserve it, especially since I'd overheard him once complaining to a coworker about alimony payments from his messy divorce 5 years back that still nipped at his heels like a persistent bill collector. The whole setup had me second-guessing my approach in those idle moments at the office when I stared at spreadsheets that no longer held any real threat to my security. Wondering if this experiment in vulnerability was just amplifying the isolation I'd built brick by brick since my ex skipped town with dreams of a fresh start in Florida, leaving me to navigate single motherhood and sibling squabbles without the buffer of a partner's support, but the momentum carried me forward anyway, compelling me to escalate the test by organizing a low-key family dinner at my place under the pretense of seeking emotional support amid my supposed downward spiral, an invitation sent via group text that framed it as a chance to lean on each other during tough times, even though deep down I knew it was a calculated move to observe their reactions up close without the distance of phone lines or digital buffers diluting the authenticity of their responses. The evening kicked off awkwardly enough with the scent of delivery pizza filling the air from boxes stacked on my coffee table that doubled as a dining surface in my compact living room adorned with faded photos of better days, like Jake's high school graduation wear. We'd all posed smiling despite the undercurrents of financial strain, and Linda swept in first as always, her heels clicking authoritatively on the hardwood as she deposited a bottle of bargain bin wine on the sideboard and immediately dominated the conversation with tales of her latest real estate conquests, describing a condo sale to some Silicon Valley transplant who overpaid by 20% because that's the market for you in this economy. All while I steered the talk toward my invented woes of impending layoffs and a car that coughed like it was on its last breath, only for her to respond with a sympathetic nod followed by a barrage of unsolicited advice on couponing apps and gig economy side hustles that she'd supposedly mastered during her own lean years. Though we both knew those were the times I'd quietly wired her money from my overtime to keep her from defaulting on that starter home she flipped into her current McMansion. Jake rolled in next, fashionably late with his hair tousled from what he claimed was a grueling band practice in a rented studio space downtown where the rent alone probably ate half his sporadic earnings from bartending shifts. And he barely acknowledged my plight beyond a mumbled, "That sucks, Mom, life's been kicking my ass too," with gigs falling through left and right, before diving into his own saga of a demo tape rejected by a minor label scout, his eyes lighting up only when Linda mentioned her connections in the music scene through one of her property clients who managed a venue, a detail that had him leaning in eagerly while offering me nothing more substantial than a half-eaten slice of pepperoni and a vague promise to look into some freelance accounting for you online, which rang as hollow as the echo in my empty savings account facade, since he'd dodged similar requests from me during his college years when tuition loomed large. Mark arrived last, but settled in with an ease that contrasted the other's edginess, bearing a tray of store-bought cookies from the corner bakery where he'd probably grabbed them on his way over after wiping grease from his hands at the shop. And as the conversation flowed unevenly around topics like gas prices spiking again and the latest headlines about retirement funds tanking in the volatile market, he slipped me an additional $500 folded discreetly into a napkin when Linda and Jake were distracted arguing over the last soda, whispering, "Don't let them know, just use it where it counts," a gesture that warmed the room's chill but also ignited a flicker of doubt because I caught the subtle tremor in his voice. The way his callous fingers lingered a second too long, as if this generosity was pulling from reserves he couldn't afford to deplete, hinting at struggles he'd kept buried like the old family secrets we'd all pretended weren't there since Mom's passing a decade ago. The real twist unraveled midway through the meal when Linda, emboldened by her second glass of wine, started reminiscing about clearing out the attic after Dad's funeral and stumbling upon a bundle of yellowed letters from Mom tucked behind loose insulation. Documents that alluded to hidden savings or assets our father had squirreled away during his factory layoffs in the 80s, funds she confessed to managing quietly afterward without looping in the rest of us. A revelation that explained her sudden financial upticks around that time and cast a long shadow over her current lifestyle of spa days and country club memberships, making the air thicken with unspoken accusations as Jake shot her a sidelong glare, and I fought the urge to press for details that might shatter the evening's fragile peace. By the time plates were cleared and the group began to disperse into the night with hugs that felt more obligatory than heartfelt, the weight of those disclosures had me retreating to the kitchen under the guise of rinsing dishes. My mind racing with the pettiness of the revenge I'd been nurturing like a slow-burning fuse ever since her dismissive seminar link, and in a burst of clever retaliation that blended humor with a dash of sharp justice, I fired off an anonymous email from a throwaway account to her local real estate association's ethics hotline, detailing just enough about that questionable property flip she'd boasted about last Thanksgiving, the one involving a rushed closing and whispers of unreported repairs, with insider knowledge only a sibling could possess, ensuring it landed like a polite bombshell without my fingerprints anywhere near it. And sure enough, as she lingered by the door waving goodbye, her phone chimed with an incoming alert that drained the color from her face, prompting a flustered excuse about competitors stirring trouble that had me suppressing a grin behind my forced concern. The satisfaction was fleeting, though, replaced by a hollow echo as the door clicked shut behind them, leaving me alone with the crumbs of uneaten cookies and the growing realization that this test was excavating resentments deeper than I'd bargained for. Only to be jolted moments later when my own phone buzzed insistently with a call from Jake, his voice edged with uncharacteristic insistence as he demanded concrete proof of my hardships like pay stubs or eviction warnings to make sure I'm not getting played here, a confrontation that forced my hand toward weaving even thicker layers of deception and left me staring at the screen in the dim light, heart hammering with the dread of how far this unraveling thread might pull before the whole fabric came apart at the seams. Mark's probing question about that anonymous tip lingered in the air like exhaust fumes from his truck as he drove away from the park, forcing me to deflect with a hasty laugh and assurances that it was just office gossip from a nosy coworker who'd overheard me venting about lottery dreams during a coffee break. But deep down, the encounter had cracked open a fissure in my carefully maintained facade, amplifying the uncertainty that had me replaying every interaction since the win in the quiet hours of my apartment where the walls seemed to close in tighter each night, making me confront the disagreeable truth that my test of family loyalties was morphing into a self-inflicted wound that isolated me further from the very people I'd hoped to reconnect with, even as past betrayals bubbled up unbidden, like the time Linda had borrowed from our joint savings account during her early real estate flops without a word of apology, or when Jake had pawned my heirloom necklace to fund a tour that fizzled out in 3 cities. Incidents I'd buried under layers of forgiveness to keep the peace, but now resurfaced with a vengeance that fueled my growing impulse for revenge, tempered by the moral dilemma of whether to abandon the charade for honesty before it poisoned what little trust remained. The conflicts escalated relentlessly in the days that followed, with Linda's texts growing curt and evasive whenever I circled back to my fabricated woes, Jake's sudden radio silence after the eviction scare suggesting he'd either been spooked into reflection or was plotting his own angle, and Mark's continued subtle check-ins via voice messages that carried an undercurrent of concern masking deeper suspicions, all of which compelled me to stage a more desperate plea by summoning them to an emergency meeting at my place under the cover of a breaking point, where I'd confess to worsening troubles like maxed-out credit cards and a phantom medical bill from a routine checkup that had ballooned into thousands, a manipulative escalation that I knew would draw eye rolls from anyone witnessing my descent into orchestration. Yet the atmosphere of impending fallout hung so thick it justified the risk in my mind as a necessary catalyst for unmasking their hypocrisies once and for all. The gathering convened on a rainy Thursday evening, the kind where thunder rumbled distantly over the city skyline and the scent of damp earth seeped through the vents, turning my living room into a pressure cooker, with Linda arriving first in a trench coat that dripped onto the entry mat, her face etched with impatience as she claimed a spot on the armchair and immediately pulled out her phone to field work emails, followed by Jake, who slouched through the door with a backpack slung over one shoulder, smelling of takeout from his latest shift, opting for the floor cushions as if committing fully might invite deeper involvement, and finally Mark, who entered last with a thermos of coffee to share, his presence a steadying force that belied the tension coiling in his posture as we all settled into an uneasy circle around the coffee table scattered with mugs and a box of tissues I'd strategically placed for dramatic effect. I launched into the narrative with practiced vulnerability, my voice cracking just enough to sell the tale of spiraling debts that threatened to upend my life completely, pleading for a collective $5,000 as a lifeline to avoid total collapse. And the responses unfolded like a scripted tragedy laced with real resentment, Linda deflecting masterfully by offering to introduce me to her financial planner, while casually dropping that she loaned Jake a similar amount just last month for band equipment, a revelation that ignited Jake's defensive outburst about her exaggerating to play the hero when in truth she'd only covered half and expected interest. The argument escalating into a full-blown airing of grievances where he accused her of always prioritizing her own family's luxuries over the broader kin, like when she'd skipped Auntie's funeral to close a deal. A betrayal that twisted loyalties right there in the room as Mark attempted to mediate with calm interjections about pulling together during hard times, only for his own facade to slip when I turned to him gratefully, prompting an admission that he'd known about Linda's handling of those inheritance letters for years, but chosen silence to preserve the fragile family dynamic after Mom's death. A choice born of exhaustion from being the perpetual peacemaker amid our parents' financial woes in the factory downturns of the 80s. The dilemmas piled on like storm clouds, my isolation peaking as I weighed the urge to confide in Mark about the lottery right then, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of something genuine that made foregoing the revenge feel like a betrayal of my own guarded heart. Yet the growing conflict overrode it, the air electric with the potential for irreparable rifts that had me clinging to the test even as it eroded the ground beneath me. As the meeting dissolved into awkward silences broken by rain pattering against the windows, the revenge took shape in a group email I composed later that night from my laptop, ostensibly a thank you note, but laced with custom memes that targeted their collective hypocrisies, a cartoonish fox in a suit for Linda hoarding acorns labeled family funds, a broke rock star chasing rainbows for Jake with captions about misplaced priorities, and a subtle nod to overlooked inheritances that had Mark chuckling wryly in his reply, content that spread through our chat like wildfire, eliciting a barrage of embarrassed denials and half apologies that forced them to confront their facades without me uttering a direct accusation, the witty sting providing a momentary rush of satisfaction amid the pettiness that left me drained and questioning if this clever payback was healing or just widening the chasms. But the high evaporated swiftly when my doorbell rang insistently around midnight, revealing Mark on the threshold with an envelope bulging with the full $5,000 in crisp bills, his expression a storm of resolve and hurt as he stepped inside and declared without preamble that he'd connected the dots from the tip-off call, the inconsistent calm in my stories, and whispers from a lottery contact he'd reached out to on a hunch, demanding to know why I'd orchestrated this elaborate test around a $15 million win and what it meant for the family bonds we'd all pretended were unbreakable. A confrontation that shattered the remnants of my deceptions and hurled me toward a reckoning where the truth demanded answers I wasn't sure I could give without losing everything in the process. Mark's midnight confrontation at my doorstep unfolded in the dim entryway light that cast elongated shadows across the cluttered console table where keys and mail accumulated like unspoken regrets. His envelope of $5,000 thrust forward as both offering and indictment while he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed the storm of emotions brewing in his eyes, a mix of betrayal and brotherly concern that forced me to guide him to the kitchen table where we'd shared countless childhood meals amid Dad's factory stories and Mom's quiet endurance, and as the rain continued its relentless tattoo against the windows, I finally unleashed the full truth in a torrent of words that had been dammed up since that lottery night, confessing the $15 million win claimed in secrecy through my lawyer's careful maneuvers to shield it from the predatory headlines that devoured so many winners' lives. Explaining How the silence stemmed from a lifetime of being the family's unspoken safety net without reciprocal support, like the thousands I'd funneled to Linda's ventures during her 90s real estate stumbles or the emergency funds for Jake's aborted music tours, culminating in this elaborate test of loyalty where I'd fabricated crises to see who would extend a hand without knowing the fortune could buy their dreams outright, a revelation that left him silent for a long stretch, his calloused fingers tracing the wood grain as he absorbed the layers of deception I'd woven, admitting in turn that his suspicions had crystallized from piecing together the anonymous tip with my too composed demeanor during pleas and the subtle inconsistencies in my stories. Yet he'd persisted in helping because family duty overrode doubt, even as his own alimony burdens and shop debts made every dollar a sacrifice, a vulnerability that humanized him further and planted seeds of ambiguity about whether his steadfastness was pure altruism or a calculated bid for eventual revelation. The conversation stretched into the early hours, laced with wry humor at the absurdity of my scheme, like joking about how I'd nearly blown the cover by splurging on premium coffee beans that raised eyebrows at the office, and a touch of light vulgarity in his gruff observation that life's too short for these chicken-hearted games, but I get it after the crap we've all pulled, forging an uneasy truce where he refused any share of the winnings outright, insisting the test had illuminated the fractures we'd ignored since Mom's passing, though the dilemmas it unearthed left me grappling with the disagreeable realization that my guarded choices had inflicted needless pain on the one relative who'd proven worthy, making me question if the isolation I'd courted was self-sabotage disguised as self-preservation. By morning, the secret's containment proved as fragile as a house of cards in a breeze, with Linda's furious call blasting through my phone speaker accusing me of sabotage via those ethics-tipped memes that had snowballed into formal inquiries at her real estate board, and Jake's subsequent texts erupting in a frenzy of demands for explanations after he'd connected the eviction fake-out to broader manipulations, compelling me to orchestrate one final family summit at a nondescript diner on the city's outskirts where the vinyl booths smelled of decades-old grease and the coffee was strong enough to cut through the tension, a neutral ground chosen to avoid the intimacy of home turf as we crammed into the space with menus clutched like shields. The air thick with unspoken grudges from inheritance skimps to parental favoritisms that had simmered since the 80s layoffs splintered our unity. I laid it all bare in measured confessions timed for maximum impact, revealing the lottery windfall and the orchestrated tests designed to probe their hearts after years of one-way streets, watching Linda's composure shatter into indignant protests about deserving a cut for her sacrifices, like managing those attic-discovered assets she'd quietly redirected during her post-divorce scramble, a detail she spun as prudent stewardship but which rang hollow against the luxuries it funded, while Jake bolted midway through the disclosure, his chair scraping loudly as he railed about exploiting his vulnerabilities when his band dreams teetered on the edge, only to return sheepishly hours later via voicemail laced with apologies tinged by hints of investment pitches for his music endeavors, his opportunism a twist that underscored the very flaws I'd sought to expose. Mark anchored the chaos with his refusal to engage in the blame game, echoing his earlier stance that blood ties were choices renewed daily rather than automatic entitlements, a perspective that clashed with the others. Grasping reactions and heightened the emotional turmoil, leaving me torn between the satisfaction of unmasked truths and the regret over choices that alienated even the redeemable bonds. The audience likely divided in their judgment of my cynicism as much as the family's greed. The ultimate revenge manifested in the ensuing weeks through a series of anonymous interventions that wove clever justice into their lives without direct confrontation, channeling portions of the winnings into targeted causes like a community mechanics scholarship fund established in Dad's name to bolster Mark's garage outreach programs, ensuring his quiet heroism received recognition and resources he wouldn't accept from me personally, while tipping off regulatory watchdogs with precise documentation on Linda's ethical gray areas in property dealings that prompted audits and forced her to confront the shortcuts she'd glorified. and setting up a grant for emerging local bands through a nondescript foundation that Jake would stumble upon too late to claim as his inspiration, the funds supporting others in his vein without enriching his opportunism directly. A witty cascade of comeuppances that satisfied the simmering resentments while maintaining my distance, infused with a humor in the irony of their windfalls circling back as lessons rather than handouts. Yet as months blurred into a tentative normalcy where interactions resumed with cautious politeness, Linda's calls laced with forced warmth, Jake's visits hinting at unspoken expectations, and Mark's steadfast presence a beacon amid the ambiguity, the deeper questions lingered unresolved like the perpetual overcast skies of an Ohio winter, pondering whether Mark's intentions harbored hidden angles born of his hardships or if they signified a rare purity in family ties, and whether sharing the fortune could mend the rifts or merely invite fresh tests of loyalty that wealth inevitably provoked, leaving my future a canvas of possibilities painted with uncertainty as I navigated the quiet life of investments and introspection, forever changed by the wind that exposed not just their flaws, but the guarded corners of my own heart, wondering if the real jackpot was learning to trust amid the inevitable betrayals or if solitude remained the safest bet in a world where money amplified every human frailty.